Hi, I'm Salas from Integral Works. Welcome to another video of our series For Better or Worse, where we try to find out what good and bad comes out of the evolution of consciousness. So every stage of consciousness solves problems of the previous stages while itself introducing new and more complex problems that then can only be solved by the next stage. That's how the evolution of consciousness works. Today I want to talk about the stage green. So green really took hold in the 1960s, and as with every stage, there were, of course, people before that time who had these ideas, who had these values, who described them. So they weren't new, but in the 60s, enough people in many societies were actually able to see these ideas and were able to understand them, so that there was a sort of tipping point. And especially the year 1968 stands out because this is totally fascinating to me. In 1968, there were protests going on all around the world in so many countries, and most of them were actually sparked by these new ideas. So many of them had a Marxist leaning philosophy, and we're going to talk about why green likes Marxism later on. But all of them wanted to topple the elite. They wanted more equality, more rights for everybody, and all at the same time. So talk about coincidence. So in this video, I want first of all to introduce green, how it works, what are its values, what is the cognition, and so on. And then we're going to talk about what the solutions were that it brought to the problems, and what new problems that it created. Right, let's talk about cognition. Right, let's talk about cognition. Cognition is always the first thing to shift to the new stage, because if you can't see something, you can't really work with it and value it or take it into your worldview, etc. You have to see it first. Green cognition is called systemic because on green, complex systems start to get visible. Simple systems were already visible on orange. So for example, the solar system, very, very simple system, but visible on orange, described by Newton. Now, more complex systems like the ecosystem, for example, or ecosystems, they are much, much more complex, and they start to be visible to green cognition. This is very important because out of this comes the realization that every object that you describe, you have to describe it in the context of its system. Otherwise, it's an abstraction. So an object isolated from its environment is like, it's not real. You're not really looking at the object. So for example, biologists realized that if they are trying to find out how monkeys live and think and what problems they can solve, they can't just put them in a lab or in a cage and observe them there. They have to go into their environment, because only there they function to their fullest potential. If you apply this to humans or to ideas, so to the realm of thought, you realize that every perspective is context bound. So the biggest realization here was that science itself is context bound. Scientific truth only exists in context. So for example, if there is a big financial incentive to examine a certain part of the world, we're going to find out far more in that part, and we might then think there is so much more complexity here than in another branch, which is not very interesting economically, and that changes our worldview, or what we would call scientific truth. So this brings us a certain amount of humility to people on the stage of green, because suddenly you realize that your perspective is context bound, just as every other perspective as well. So for example, if you say that object over there is green and I look at it and I see it red, I'm not just going to dismiss your perspective, I'm going to have to get into your context, then look at it again, and only then I can judge your perspective on the object. That is what healthy green multi-perspectivism looks like. This can get very sick, as every stage has its own sick versions, and on green, that is from the healthy perspective of every person has their own context, and therefore every perspective has its value or its right of existence. I'm getting to every perspective is right, which is not the same thing. And it's actually really ridiculous, because suddenly you say everybody has their own truth. So there is no truth. I'm going to get into that later, but just to say that there's a healthy and a sick version of green. So now we are in the realm of worldview. Multi-perspectivism is part of the green worldview. Another important factor is the systemic part, because when you have systemic cognition and you apply it to the world, you see that the world is not made up of objects. That was the orange notion, but it's actually made up of systems of objects. So if you change anything, if you change any object, you change the whole system. And here we get into the values. The development of values on green comes out of the worldview. When you see systems, you want those systems to be healthy. So for example, ecological responsibility, green value. You see the damage that we're doing to the ecosystem, and you see the consequences of our actions, and you want people to behave responsibility toward the system that they are part of. Now the same goes for social systems, because you want these systems to be healthy as well. For example, systemic injustice or systemic racism is something that green very loudly wants to show everybody, and that's the reason why it always concentrates on minorities, because here you can really see how the system is not healthy. So for example, green might point out that equal opportunity itself is not enough. So in the last video I made the example of when you have a public building and everybody has to have access to it. If there is a stair instead of a ramp, not everybody has access to it. So the equal opportunity actually isn't really an equal opportunity for everybody if you don't look at minorities. And so this is a very important addition to the idea of equality that green makes. Hey guys, this is me in post-production. Reviewing this content, I realized that I put a whole lot of stuff into this video, and it's actually very easy to get lost. So let me give you an overview of what to expect now. So first, we're going to look at the collective solutions that green brings, and you're going to see environmentalism and social justice movements. Then in the second part about the individual, you will see the shift of focus on emotional well-being, the change of relationships, so deeper relationships, and starting self-acceptance. As you've probably realized, we're already talking about the new solutions that green brings to the table. So just in the environmental section alone, green has done so much to prevent further environmental damage. There has to be done more, and this is always true. You can always say that, but just where I live, rivers and lakes are cleaner than they were in the 70s. Forests are actually growing. There is every year there is new legislation passed about how you can use pesticides and fungicides, etc., to prevent destruction of the environment and to prevent erosion of the topsoil, etc., etc. So green has done a lot in this area. The same is true for social justice. So where I live, it's almost impossible to go hungry. When you earn very little and you have to feed kids at home, there is a huge social safety net that will prevent you from poverty. And the same is true for most nations where green has a strong foothold. So it will point to the social injustices and the unhealthy system and try to change it with legislation, try to get funding for NGOs, etc., just to mend the system and to make it more just. Green is also very much responsible for women in the workforce, so that we are talking about how women should have the same opportunities to get into higher positions in companies. So there is another section that I don't want to get into because it's huge, and that is science. So think of just in the physics field alone, green cognition is responsible for relativity, for quantum theory. This is all stuff that wouldn't be able with just the rational mind. It needs at least a pluralistic or systemic mind. I don't want to get into that because it's a huge topic. Let's instead talk about what changes for the individual to the better when it comes to green. There's actually a good example in modern pop culture of what it looks like when an individual shifts from orange to green, and that is the movie American Beauty. It's actually a very typical case because it shows a normal working guy having a midlife crisis and suddenly questioning every decision that he made before, because the decisions that he made with an orange mindset. So there was always a goal, there was always a picture that he wanted to achieve in life. And suddenly he realizes if he's completely honest with himself, he's not happy. He's not happy with his wife. He's not happy with his job. He's not happy with the way that he treats his body. So he starts changing stuff in his life. And that is really actually close to the truth of what happens when you go to green. You take the focus from the future or from some hypothetical goal that you want to achieve, and then you think you will be happy. And you shift that focus more and more to the present moment and start asking yourself, am I really doing what I want to do? Am I really, okay, I make a lot of money. Does it really make me happy? No, actually, I want to play the guitar. I want to be an artist. I want to, whatever. There's many stereotypical examples, but I think you get what I mean. You start looking at what really makes you happy, and especially in relationships. So relationships change very dramatically when done seriously. So you start asking yourself, is this person really interested in what I'm saying? Is this person really listening? Is this person really trying to see my perspective? And you yourself do the same thing. So suddenly you have these real connections with people, and this is not even limited to your closest friends or to your family, but to everybody. You have a human connection, or a possible human connection, to every human being in the world. And you're not just kinder toward other human beings, you start being kinder toward yourself, because you are also a human being that has flaws and weaknesses, that has needs and that has emotions that need to be taken care of, the same as every other person. So there is a kind of self-acceptance that takes place when you shift to green. Hey guys, it's me again. Now we go to the new problems that green brings. And on the individual side, you will first see psychological issues like narcissism, and also counterintuitively self-negation. Then we go to the collective side, and we will talk about the mean green meme first, and I will explain what that is. Then we look at the victim culprit mode that is built into mean green meme worldview, and the link to Marxism that I talked about earlier. And of course, the resulting breakdown of dialogue and polarization. Now, of course, there's a flip side to all of this. And the relativistic worldview that opens your mind when you shift to green also has a cost. And the cost is a loss of orientation, because suddenly it's much harder to actually have, to find truth, to actually have a reference point where you know, okay, this is true, and now I can build on top of this. Because if everything is relative and all perspectives have their value, who actually is right? This can get very ugly. As I already mentioned, on green, some people shift more and more toward everybody is right. And that is a big assumption to make, and actually a false assumption, because that just doesn't make sense. When you say everybody's right, there is no truth anymore. The concept of truth breaks down when everybody has a truth. And so this loss of orientation can more and more shift towards a sort of nihilism, a cynicism, even depression, or just what we're seeing a lot today, just narcissism. Because if nothing is right, if there is no true value in the world, well, it's very easy to say, okay, then I am the only true value in my world. That, of course, happens more or less unconsciously, but it's actually the result of the breakdown of true values. Another thing that can affect you in a very negative way is the tendency of green to focus on the outside, to focus on the other people's happiness. So altruism. And this starts out, of course, as actual care for everybody else and for the system, as we've seen. But it can shift dramatically towards self-negation, to a breakdown of self-confidence, to a negation of your own needs. And I know this from my personal past, because from my personality, I already have the tendency to focus on the needs of other people instead of my own. And on green, that got to a very dramatic point where I was actually very unhappy. Okay, getting to the collective, we have to talk about what Ken Wilber coined the mean green meme, because this is a part of green that goes into the extremes, and it goes into the extremes because their tools no longer work. So green cognition and worldview comes to an end and can't solve its own problems anymore. And so they start degrading, they start becoming decadent in a way. And that's what he calls the mean green meme. It's characterized by a lot of stuff that we've already talked about, by, for example, this narcissism. And in that narcissism, the much lower stage red actually can show up in a very dramatic way. So you remember red that we talked about, that is very egotistical and very self-asserting and can even get violent. And green starts to take up this part of itself again, but covering it with the best intentions of green. So kind of making this Frankensteinian monster that is very hard to kill, actually. So a thing that can happen to the worldview on green when it becomes rather sick is it comes from the notion that everybody is equal, which, as I said before, is already an over-the-top assumption that green makes when it comes to when it starts running into problems. So it just starts assuming everybody is equal. This is something that it doesn't question or try to find evidence for. It's an assumption of every discussion where green is involved. Now, if everybody is equal, then there is a series of logic steps that leads to hell, and I'm gonna take you down that road. If everybody is equal, then how come we see all of these differences in the world? How come people don't earn the same amount of money? How come people don't have the same amount of money? How come not all people are happy? How come not all people get the great jobs that they want? If everybody is equal, and there is inequality in the world, the only rational reason for that to happen is oppression. Oppression. And here we see the connection between green worldview and values and Marxist and communist values, because that weird notion that everybody is equal plays right into the worldview of communism, because if everybody is equal, they should have equal outcome. So let's make every work and every competence equal. Then we are at a level where everybody has the equal outcome. And from that to an oppressive regime, it's a very small step, because if green is right and everybody is equal, cool, no problem. Everybody gets the same, everybody works the same, awesome. If it's not right and people are not equal, then this is the most oppressive regime that you can imagine. You have to do stuff that you don't want. You don't get the money that your work is worth. You don't get to decide how long, where, and how you're going to work, who you're going to marry, who you're going to spend your time with. You get to decide nothing, because it has to be equal for everybody. If everybody is equal and there is inequality in the world, the only rational reason for that to happen is oppression. And here we get to the victim culprit worldview that green has. And this again is an assumption. It's built into that weird, sick worldview of the mean green meme. There has to be a victim and a culprit. And usually the victim is the minority. So if you're a minority, you're safe. If you're not a minority, you have to go out of your way to prove that you are so conscious about not being a minority and actually being the culprit. So then you are also safe, then you are woke. And so that, with the mixture of less and less reference because everybody is right, makes it absolutely impossible to have a serious discussion with this sort of mean green meme. The only reason to have a discourse is to prove that you are conscious of your privilege, to prove that you're not the bad guy. And then if everybody's not the bad guy, we can agree on somebody else who's not in the room to be the bad guy, and we can actually wash our hands and be done with it. But that's it. It doesn't go on from there. There's no search for actual solutions to real problems. And this is especially problematic because green is in most modern countries the leading edge. So it should actually have a kind of an authority. It should actually take care of the rest of the developmental spiral. Instead, what green does is it negates its own development. So the view that it has, which is a highly developed view, you saw it with the other, in the process of the other videos, that it went to a series of very tough steps to get to that higher worldview and to those higher values. But it does not take that into account. It actually says, no, that can't be, because that would actually indicate that there is a hierarchy, and every hierarchy must be an oppressor hierarchy. So I'm not going to be the oppressor. I'm equal to everybody else. Instead, that my view is the only right view. There is constant contradictory stuff like that in discussions with green. And this leads to total breakdown of dialogue and the very polarization that green should be able to heal, because it is the highest stage, because it has the responsibility. It actually makes it so much worse because it constantly negates every other opinion. It negates the value of the developmental stage that it's at, and at the same time, of course, has to negate the value of every other stage as well. Right, so I hope you have enjoyed this video on green. In the next one, we're going to see how teal solves problems that green creates, while itself introducing new ones. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.